Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. You know, it's times such as these with, well, the Prime Minister's allegations regarding India's alleged involvement in a murder plot, Chinese interference, the economy on the brink. It's at this point that we realize how important it is that we need more access to information, more sources of information, and more insight. So it really raises the question, which is why Ottawa is moving so dramatically and so quickly with Bill C-18, which has the effect of restricting information sources, even silencing some. So we are going to speak with Michael Geist. At the end of the session in June, when this bill was kind of passed through very quickly, we had a session with Michael to go through it, but some things have changed. So a little update. Michael Geist, of course, as you know, the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa. He's got his own podcast on which he raises many of these same issues called Law Bites. Michael, welcome. Good to see you.
Oh, nice to see you too. Thanks again for having me.
So there it was late in August, the 21st, I think, the new minister came out and said, we're going to consult on this and find out what the regulations might really mean for everybody in the business. And the CRTC said the same. And then a week later, the long weekend rolls around, I guess, when they think nobody's watching, and they go, nope, no more consultation. Let's just get this done. We're going to put the rules in place. What happened?
Well, I mean, we might back up from when I last joined just to note that a lot happened certainly over the summer. I think consistent with what many expected and predicted, the response from the two companies most directly affected by this legislation, Meta and Google, was to say that if the structure continued, they would block news links or block news results from their search index. In the case of Meta, that's exactly what they've done. I know that your committee repeatedly heard this was just a bluff that nobody should take seriously. And yet, as we record this now, it's been many weeks that Meta has in fact blocked news links. And it should be noted, all news links, not just Canadian news, but all news on the platform, as they read the legislation as to effectively require that if they're going to comply with the law by not being a digital news intermediary. Google remains a little more circumspect. They have said that if it remains in its current structure, they will, before the law takes effect, which would be December 19th of this year, do much the same thing. They were waiting for the regulations that you just cited. And so the government did bring forward regulations. They are open to a consultation. The government said that they were moving quickly, but they didn't cut off consultation all the time. Complete consultation, I believe.
This doesn't look like there's much time for it.
There is not a lot of time. I believe the consultation's open until early October, and they've noted that it's a condensed time frame to do that. And part of the reason for that is that at your committee, there was inclusion very late of an additional amendment that said that the law would take effect by December 19th. And that was not the case previously. Before that, it was a bit more of a rolling process, and there would have been an opportunity for, I think, a bit more considered consultations. But one of your colleagues on that committee, Senator Maville Deschênes, according to reports on behalf of Quebecor, put forward an amendment to say that this has to take effect within 6 months, and so that's created this compressed time frame. But beyond the compressed timing,
just let me interrupt for a sec. So it looks as if the reason there's such speed with this is because the big print news operations want the money as soon as possible.
Well, they wanted to accelerate this. At the same time, one of the events over the summer was the CRTC came out with a timeline for its process, which could drag all the way into 2025. So it doesn't feel like anybody's getting, well, it's possible nobody's going to get any money at all out of this. But even if Google does come to the table, the timing is going to take, I think, longer than they expected. But putting a stop clock effectively on the legislation has had the effect, I think, of crystallizing certainly Facebook's approach or Meta's approach, and has also put Google in a similar position where they say they have no choice but to make a decision. by the deadline, and the effect of that is to really limit the kind of conversations they might otherwise have. It was possible, if there was a bit more time, they could have started talking to many of the media companies even without a CRTC process to determine who in fact is an eligible news business. But there might have been that possibility. The timelines have really shrunk now, though, and then they did shrink as well, as you say, with respect to the amount of consultation on these regs. I'm sure there are many groups will respond to the government's initial draft regs, but I will say that given where things were at when they were released, where Meta was out, Google had made it clear that it was likely to go out as well. I don't know that the regulations really represent an attempt to really bridge some of the divide and try to address some of the ongoing concerns, which I think has left a lot of people pretty pessimistic about the prospect that Google will come around. And
I mean, I raised the question of the issue about the money because we saw, just days ago, the newspaper lobby saying we were getting under the current system of subsidies from the government, which is separate and apart from the money they may get from big tech, but they were getting about $14,000 a head for each employee, and they want that to double. They want that to go to $30,000 a head. So clearly their financial crunch is getting worse, and maybe they see that this problem with the regulations is going to stall out delivery of the money, or as you say, if both Google and Meta are out, there is no money. So they've got to keep getting more from the government directly.
Yeah, there's a bit of fun with numbers, I think, on the part of what News Media Canada had to say there. What matters, I think, is less the actual number and more the percentage of what the labor journalism tax credit covers. And so when they put out that new number, they gave a higher number for the average salary of what a journalist would cover. So that resulted in a much larger number. From a percentage perspective, what they asked for is that at the moment it's 25%. They've said they would like to see it increase to 35% of labor costs for those journalists.
Everything becomes a state media outlet at that rate of compensation.
Well, I think it's worse than that. I think you're right. It's 35% of the labor costs would be subject to the tax credit. They then, if you look at the kind of numbers the government has in mind with respect to what they would like to see Google and Meta put in, and of course the government is reflecting what News Media Canada and some others have been pushing for, it's basically another 35%. And so you're then looking at roughly 70% of those news costs, if this were to play out in the way that the government would like it to. 70% of those news costs covered by government regulation in one form or another. Government regulation either by way of tax or government regulation by way of these mandated agreements. And I think that that's an astonishing figure. It's actually very comparable to the support that the CBC gets. And
that's what I'm saying. We're going to have nothing but government funded media. And that raises serious questions about objectivity, free speech. The list is long.
Huge questions. Now, note that the 35% of the labor journalism tax credit doesn't cover broadcasters. So in that case, we are talking about traditional news media, print and digital, not the broadcasters. But the broadcasters are, of course, standing there ready to take money from Google and Meta, including the CBC, which based on these regulations, it seems likely the CBC would be the biggest beneficiary of all if this were to actually come to pass. And we'd see these kind of agreements that the government wants to see.
Which is so bizarre because they're already funded to the tune of over $1 billion by taxpayers that they could possibly believe they are due more money. Well, I think it has a lot of people puzzled. The other thing I think, Michael, that is really important to highlight now, and we heard, and because you followed the committee hourly and daily, is all of the young creative news generating entrepreneurs, the new sites, the new forms for discussing news, discussing ideas, offering insight into big issues. They are the ones that are really being slammed by this.
They are. That's absolutely right. And I think that was also predicted and predictable that they would face the most severe consequences if Facebook, for example, were to block news links as they have. And the reason's pretty, readily apparent. Many of those startups are at an early stage, and they're looking to try to develop community, looking to develop an audience. Social media is a prime way that they do that. And so, for example, I had someone on my podcast, Chris Din from a site in Toronto called Torontoverse, who indicated that his site lost about 50% of their traffic when those links dropped away, and he's had to lay off people and really essentially put much of his growth on hold. Village Media has said that it's more like 17% for them. They're a bit better established, but at the same time, they have stopped all growth plans altogether. They're simply not doing any hiring in light of what's taken place. And so I think that the impact on investment was really an underrated, understated issue. Wasn't fully appreciated that this legislation would have that kind of impact. And the irony, to bring it back to the established players, is that it's the established players that make out okay. I was on a panel this week with media representatives from a number of different places, and one of the consensus positions was that the biggest beneficiary, whether this works out or not, is the CBC. It's a beneficiary if it works out, that because they get the largest portion of the money from Google amongst any of the various entities. Even if nobody gets anything, they're the ones that are left standing better than anyone because they've got the secured money that comes from the government. And CBC is a big winner. There are other big winners potentially, or at least winners that they see competition kind of dry up, that many of their new upstarts
from all the new upstarts
just don't exist in the marketplace anymore. So it's a really bad situation if part of your priority is to incent new innovation in the space, new startups, and try to essentially build or rebuild some of the new space. And instead, what you've got is a system that really re-emphasizes the CBC and some of the large legacy players who benefit from some of their competition disappearing.
And the irony again, I mean, there are so many things, but is that the ones that will be able to survive at all in this system are ones that are going back to the original model, which is a subscription.
Well, we're seeing a lot of that.
The old days.
Yeah, no, and listen, there are lots of different business models, and those that want to move towards subscription, if they think that works best for them, then by all means. I actually think, ironically, that it does highlight the importance of the CBC. If we do move to a world in which paywalls are one of the dominant business models, then to me that highlights that I think there is a necessity to ensure that people have free and open access to news, that you shouldn't have to buy subscriptions to have access to the news. That makes the CBC valuable, but the part of the problem here is the CBC doesn't seem to recognize that. It instead wants to align itself as little different from the private broadcasters or some of the private entities and compete for the same dollars, when at a time when there are, of course, those that would like to see some of that money clawed back and less support for the CBC. This actually provides, I think, a fairly compelling argument for why you'd want to fund it. If you want to make the case that people should have free and open access to the news, CBC is a good source of that, but then it should be there saying, listen, we want this content to be made as broadly available as possible, as widely disseminated, reused by others. It'll be openly licensed so that others can make use of it because the public's paid for it.
Yeah. But the problem is, and all you have to do is look at the CBC numbers, viewer numbers, is to, that they're not speaking to people. They're not dealing with the issues that the mass audience is looking to have discussed. Otherwise, their viewership numbers would obviously be much higher.
Yeah, listen, I think it's a competitive environment. I'm not going to get into a critique of the content on the CBC, and I have a sense that there are different perspectives depending on whether we're talking about television or radio or digital, whether it's in French language or in English. But regardless of where it's at, I do think that there is a case to say that there's value in open, credible content that is available to all without the need for subscriptions and payment, because that's just that there is a public good in that. I kind of wish the CBC would embrace that as sort of it's one of its real raison d'etre, and instead, as I say, it seems to completely miss it. And heard a recent podcast discussion with Catherine Tate, who took the opposite approach. It was like, well, no, why should we give Facebook or Google free access to our content. And of course, the
Yeah.
point is
That's
you're
the
not giving them
president of the
free access.
CBC, for those that don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, what you are doing is actually enhancing the likelihood that the Canadian public will see this content, which is precisely what you should see as one of your core goals.
A couple of other points. The prime minister and some of his ministers went on about, this was going to be boycotted, the big tech, no more advertising, no more posting content. The prime minister even put his own personal information about the state of his marriage, the separation, used Instagram to do that. The Liberal Party is still advertising. So somebody called a boycott and nobody showed up.
Yeah, we've seen a couple of attempts to sort of launch those kind of boycotts. We've seen on the one hand government saying that they would stop advertising, and they'd hope that many would follow suit. But Liberal Party continues to advertise. In fact, Justin Trudeau on his own personal Facebook is running ads. Literally this week launched new ads, and so it's a bit dizzying to, on the one hand, make the claim that this is a fight akin to the Second World War, and at the same time continue to provide the company with money through advertising, because you see some of the value there. There have also been at least a couple of attempts to say we're going to boycott Facebook by not posting on it or using it for the day. On one of the most recent ones, the prime minister actually posted on that exact same day. Yeah. And, the data, we've seen some reports, the data suggests that Facebook, in fact, has not seen a significant decline in usage in Canada. It hasn't changed much. In fact, there's some reports that have suggested that the experience on Facebook has improved without news on the platform. It's kind of reverted back to what it used to be, more about your friends and community and things like that.
We heard that testimony from the Googles and the Metas, and they said, look, it's a small chunk of what we do. We're not taking ad dollars from anybody else because nobody wants to buy ads on the news section. They're doing it in other parts of the platform.
Right. That's a good point. That's certainly true with respect to Google, where they've made the case that ads against news is really a very small part of the business. There's plenty of ads if you're running a search for a medical procedure, or you're running a search for a car or some other product. If you're running a search against the news of the day, some weather incident or some other activity, the truth is there's not a lot of people advertising against it. So it tends not to generate a ton of money on the Google platform. In the case of Facebook, what they said was that, listen, this content's highly substitutable, that if your goal as a social media company is to keep people on the platform for as long as possible, that news was largely indistinguishable from other forms of content. People stayed on the platform the same amount of time. In fact, if anything, news was bad content if you're a social media company, because it actually did send people away as opposed to keeping them on the platform. And that, at least from some of the reports that are out there, seems to have played out, that this has not had a negative impact on traffic, which suggests that the news sector, I think to extent the government as well, which basically made the bet that Facebook and Meta could not live without Canadian news. It was just too important, so that they could create a legislative framework that would force them to pay if they link, and that they would simply have no commercial alternative but to link. And so that was kind of the bet, and it was a bad bet, and many told them it was a bad bet, and we've seen that play out right now.
So Michael, it does really come back to that original question, with all the evidence to the contrary, the people who are impacted most, who came and testified with passion and statistics and evidence, why the government was so intent on doing this. I still can't, for the life of me, see the reason. Have you figured it out yet?
No. I wish I had a good answer. I mean, it's very reminiscent of Bill C-11, where again, against all evidence, the government just kept doubling down again and again on the issue around user content. In this instance, I just think that there was, I think that many within the government, I think egged on by certainly the lobby groups that were pushing for this legislation, and indeed some of the witnesses that appeared before your committee and at the House, who were just so convinced that this was Australia 2.0. It was just a bluff. and that as long as you carried on, that the companies would eventually just pony up and pay. And I think it was a bad misread of what took place in Australia. I think it was a
Yeah,
bad
I mean,
misread of the
Australia
value of
learned
news.
that lesson, right? That the companies simply circumvented the law.
Well, listen, the companies sort of obviously did strike deals, which is what they were
Yeah.
most hoping for.
I
Government.
don't mean anything illegal. I'm just saying they read the bill and said, this is the new world. We'll get ourselves out of the line of fire.
Yes, by negotiating with the government and ultimately striking deals. And I think that's what the Canadian government thought would happen here too. They thought that, well, they'll huff and puff, but eventually they will strike deals. And, had they been paying a bit more attention, especially let's say in the case of Meta, they would have recognized that that company had been de-emphasizing news for
Yeah.
quite a period of time. The company was very consistent, from day one. There's lots of reason to criticize Meta, but in this instance, they really told the same story from the first moment, that if the legislation was going to be based on mandated payments for links, which is at the end of the day what the foundation of what this law is, that this was for them just sort of a bridge too far, largely because they said, listen, if anything, they make the case that they're providing value back to the media companies by providing them with free links, with posts that in the majority of which are posted by the media companies themselves. And, as I say, I just think, I think you can look at the need to regulate or the benefits of regulating social media and search, and you can make a choice. You could say, listen, I want to ensure that they carry certain kinds of content and that there's fairness in the respect to the way that content appears. So I'm going to regulate that. You can make the case that you want them to pay for content that you find, even with respect to links. But I don't think you can make the case that you can force them to carry content and pay for that content. You kind of have to choose. And in this instance, it feels like they said, well, we think we can thread the needle here by forcing them to pay for links, and we think they will have no choice but to link because this content is so important and so valuable to them. And it was a bad misread of where things were at. And so they've ended up with nothing, no payments and no links.
Yeah, it's just as puzzling, and I don't know, whether they kind of got cocky because of C-11 and that was, they managed to kind of get through that, whether they're testing the waters for the online harms. But just before we go there, because I want to, but the Prime Minister also said the other day that, privately, people are telling him, other world leaders, which is, go for this. You're breaking ground for us, et cetera, et cetera. On the other side, however, I see 44 congresspeople have written to the U.S. Trade Representative to say, woe up with this. They're trying to impose rules on American companies operating in the Canadian jurisdiction, and part of the free trade agreement doesn't let you do that. You can't impose rules extraterritorially, if that's a word. So it doesn't look like everybody's really cheering them on here.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of elements there. I don't. It may be that privately some people are telling the prime minister that, hey, go for it, but they don't have much skin in the game if they're doing that. And the truth is that it's smaller Canadian media companies, it's Canadians themselves that are paying the price on this, and the current approach simply isn't effective at all. And in fact, I think we've reached the point where the Canadian model is really being seen as something to avoid as opposed to emulate. So it's one thing in the background to say, hey, you go, but the reality is nobody wants to go there. In terms of the digital sales tax, this has been a simmering issue for some time. And I actually do think that the best way, frankly, to get these companies to make what would be seen as fair contributions is through taxation. The problem or the concern that arises with respect to the DST is that there have been attempts to come up with a global system around some of these issues. I think the question around fairness of contribution from big companies generally, but particularly big tech, is pretty universal. There are a lot of countries that have similar kinds of concerns. So then the question becomes, how do you achieve that? There have been attempts to achieve an international agreement. There is one actually at the OECD. The challenge has been implementing it. And just about everybody agreed to defer, in effect, the sort of the deadline for this to take effect by a year as they try to hash this out. And the Canadian approach is, and we stand a bit alone here, has been to say, well, no, we're moving ahead with our tax in next year in 2024. and we're not prepared to defer that. It may be that Canada needs the revenue. There are rumors that they've essentially booked or really considered how they were going to spend that
I'm
revenue.
sure they have, because
And
they're
it's
spending.
note that it's retroactive. It goes back 3 years, and so we're
Yeah.
not. It's not a trivial amount of money. The challenge we face, I think, with all of that, and as I say, I think ostensibly tax is the right way to go about doing this, but you also need allies, and the risks we face, we see it playing out right now with the situation with India and looking for allies on that front. We see it, I think, playing out with respect to some of our other legislative initiatives like C-18, like Bill C-11, is frankly that if you're creating nothing but trade irritants, it's unlikely that you're going to, get the kind of support you need when you need it. And so
And
you'd need to be a bit more strategic, perhaps, about some of those choices.
I mean, the larger problem, as you've noted with a tax, is that does go into general revenues. So it becomes very obvious that government's just looking for a cash grab, as opposed to what the tech companies were offering, saying, if you want us to help fund journalism, we'll help fund journalism. You set up a fund, we'll put money into it. I mean, they end up with the cleaner hands on this one, saying, if what you're trying to do is save the news business in Canada, will help. It doesn't look like the government that's really their priority when it comes down to it.
Yeah, well, listen, the DST is far broader than C-18. Who's touched by it, this digital services tax, goes far beyond just these couple of platforms. It actually involves a much larger number of companies, and it does go into general revenues. And this speaks to these kind of competing objectives. At the moment, the government basically wants both. They would like 3% digital services tax, retroactive 3 years starting in January. They would also like, according to the regulations, 4% of the search revenues or social media revenues to be paid for coming out of Bill C-18. And they would like, we know, hundreds of millions to be paid coming out of Bill C-11 in terms of contributions to film and TV production. So you're going to that same pot again and again and again. If you're a company like Google, the taxes are what they are, and if we pass it, they're going to pay those taxes. But if you've got C-18s structured as an approach that there are multiple ways to comply, one is to link and pay, and another is to stop linking and not pay. And if you're facing some of these other financial obligations, I don't think it should surprise anyone that you'd have a company that would say, okay, well, hold on a second, we need to consider whether or not we're paying out 7% or even more of
we want to do
revenues
business here
to cover these things. So I understand why they're looking for this, but the costs are significant. One interesting way, and I haven't seen it much discussed, but in theory, the government could say, okay, we're going to put in the DST, but to the extent to which you reach any agreements under this mandated bargaining code, the spending that you put into those agreements can be used to offset your payments under the DST, so that you could actually allocate, in effect, some of that digital services tax towards media. But we all know that finance is loath to say that money that's going into general revenue goes into specific programs. So you're right back to kind of that challenge.
No, because we're heading toward an election sooner or later, and they want control over how money is spent, not pre-allocated. So that is always a problem. We're watching. I think the Brits have just brought down their version of the online harms bill, and that's an issue in this country. And I just put that against a decision. It was a state decision, I think, Missouri versus Biden, on politics and censorship, where there was actually a court ruling against government in the U.S. saying you can't keep phoning up big tech companies and tell them what to put on their platform and what not to. That's also the simmering issue that's underlying all of this stuff, as we've heard from testimony from the big tech guys in front of Congress, that those conversations did go on. How do you think those two things meet?
Well, on the issue of online harms, I think we are likely to see a new bill introduced probably in the fall. At least that's what the government has said. And they may call it online safety, they may call it online harms, but it will be in some ways potentially even more controversial than some of these other bills.
It will be.
So it's, because it does go even more directly to speech online. In terms of sort of the interactions that take place between governments and and the tech companies, it seems to me that you get criticisms coming from both sides of the aisle. You'll get some that say that you're being too aggressive to remove stuff. Sometimes we're hearing that you're not being aggressive enough. I think, frankly, tech companies would generally just like to say, "Hey, give us the rules that we need to follow, and we'll follow
Yeah.
them." I frankly think that many instances, I think these issues are overstated. I don't think tech companies are looking to promote a particular political angle, either right or left. But I think they are facing a lot of different competitive pressures. I think there's often a lack of transparency associated with the process, and we would do well to have both more transparency associated with how this functions. We would do well to have rules to ensure the tech companies comply with what they say they are going to do, so that we have better assurances that when they set out certain policies, that they actually live by those policies. To me, those are, I think, places where there would be value in regulating. But if there's a concern about where things go with online harms, is that there will be pressure, I am sure, to sort of expand this beyond areas where there is already clear speech regulation into, what we sometimes think of as the awful but lawful speech, stuff that raises problems but is still lawful speech. And will this be an attempt to sort of, in a roundabout way, trying to regulate some of that content? And that, of course, raises all sorts of charter issues.
Yeah, because we're hearing people use the word hate, including the prime minister again this week. The battle between parents and special interest groups on at what point do you talk about gender and pronouns and all that stuff, and the big demonstrations that we saw. But the prime minister then said there's no room for this kind of hate. Like, we're now to the point where disagreement, when people have two very heartfelt but very different positions, I think most of us recognize what hate is. But when we start to call difference hate, then this becomes more problematic.
Yeah, to me, I see it a little bit differently. That may have been the language he used. To me, it's more about the perception of harms, and I think there are real harms from some of the things that we've seen raised around some of these issues. And if you're trying to legislate against those sorts of harms, that's where it becomes difficult at a minimum. And that's not to say I think these harms are oftentimes real, and we want to find solutions for this. I'm not sure that the legislative hammer is always the best way to address some of those issues, though.
Yeah, I think that's and again, that's where it comes back kind of full circle, which is you sometimes have these discussions and reach some kind of compromise before you write the legislation, before you make it law, because it's really hard to undo it once you've made it law.
It is. That is certainly the case. You're right. We see, people pay a lot of attention and engage in sort of active advocacy around issues, because once you've got something in place, it's very difficult to undo. I think that's absolutely the case. Listen, there have been certainly some consultations around these issues. The government actually went back to the drawing table after they put out one consult document that was roundly criticized. Suppose we'll have to wait to see how this plays out. I guess for me, it's less about where we start and more about where we finish. If there has been a concern with the process around the other internet bills that have come out of Heritage, and I would just note as an aside, it's not entirely clear to me why it is that Heritage is leading, certainly on online harms. I actually don't understand at all why that is a Heritage issue. As a lead, I understand why they may want to participate, but surely there are public safety elements, there are justice elements, there are ISET elements. Why this is a Heritage file is a bit inexplicable to me. But even putting that to the side, the experience with the other bills coming out of Heritage on C-11, C-18, consistent with our discussion, I think has been that there is a deep reluctance to change the legislation once it is introduced as a bill. There's oftentimes, and I've been on the receiving end of this, attempt to demonize critics or dismiss them altogether. It's to use many of the hearings as a bit of just theater, where you just bring in a bunch of supportive voices and say, hey, we heard that this was great. And there's very little openness to reform it. And it does seem to me that frankly, all of these issues, but certainly with online harms or online safety, this ought to be an issue where we are able to find some amount of common ground. And our goal ought to be to try to get the best possible piece of legislation that both provides some support for the kind of harms that exist online, and at the same time ensure that we are safeguarding freedom of expression to the maximum extent that we can. And I think that means coming in with a bit of an open mind about how to get the best bill possible. And I don't feel that that's what we've seen with both the experience in C-11 and C-18, where it was much more of a race to get that legislation forward without a lot of consideration for the consequences. And to bring this back full circle, we're certainly seeing that now with C-18. I think there was no plan B. There was a failure to really appreciate what those consequences were. And now there are no winners, just a whole lot of harm that's taking place.
Yeah, and I
from the
mean, it just
legislation.
turns out to be just a really bad policy. That's all. Like it just, dysfunctional. Just a final quick point. If you're a betting man on this one, what are you going to say about Google? Do you think they'll find some way to do business or not?
Yeah, I've been asked that already a few times this week.
Yeah,
I must admit,
sorry.
it's okay. I must admit, I don't think anybody knows, and I certainly don't.
Yeah.
I think I would say this: if we take the company at its word, and what they said when the legislation came out was that they did not think it was workable, but they were willing to wait to see the regulations. If the regulations continue to look as they do, then my fear is, because I think this would be disastrous. But my fear is that they will, in fact, move to block news, that the global precedent of a 4% floor, a minimum payment of 4% of the revenues. You can quibble over the formula that the government uses to arrive at this point, but they've made clear what they want is a 4% floor. Is something that Google will simply say is not sustainable globally, and so they will say that they are going to have to follow Facebook's lead.
As always, Michael, thank you for being so clear and focused on this. I know you've dedicated most of your waking hours for the last couple of years to this. Even, I should tell people, bringing his class to a Senate committee, which was really a great experience for us to on that side, to make sure that this conversation is really being held at all generational levels. So it's great.
Okay.
Thanks, Michael.
Well, thank you for having me.
The Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa, and just everybody's go-to guy on this issue because he spends so much time thinking it through. That is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. We'll see you soon.